A Historical Survey of the Shentong Tradition in Tibet by Cyrus Stearns. Chapter 2 in The Buddha from Dölpo, a study of the life and thought of the Tibetan master Dölpopa Sherab Gyaltsen. This advice by the omniscient Dölpopa should be kept as the key point in our hearts. If Buddhahood will be reached merely as a result of having heard the term Sugata essence, what need to mention what will happen from actualizing that by means of faith and devotion, and meditating on it? Thus, compassionate experts should teach it even if they might lose their lives and so forth, and those who strive for liberation should seek it out and listen even if they must cross a great pit of fire. Jamgon Kongtrul. Little is known about the early Tibetan proponents of philosophical points of view that would later come to be known as Shentong. According to Lai Gyaltsen, many persons with partial realization of the teachings of definitive meaning had appeared in Tibet before the 14th century, most of them dedicated practitioners. But no one until Dölpopa had mastered all the teachings of definitive meaning in the various scriptures, treatises, and esoteric instructions, and then formulated that realization into a coherent philosophical tenet. Tāranātha traces one lineage for what he calls instructions on the view of the madhyamaka emptiness of other, and a second lineage for the Kala Chakra teachings passed down in the Jonang tradition. The first of these concerns the practical instructions that epitomize the intentions of all the sutras and commentaries of the third turning of the Dharma wheel. This lineage is primarily traced through Maitreya and the Indian brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu, who are considered the founders of the doctrine, but a transmission is also traced from Nagarjuna. This first text is a record of the names of teachers who taught the Shentong view based on the teachings of the Mahayana scriptures and commentaries. Jetsun Tāranātha's second text, concerned with the lineage of the Kala Chakra teachings transmitted in the Jonang tradition, records the names of teachers who taught the Shentong view based on the Tantras, specifically as articulated in the Kala Chakra Tantra, and related literature. Examples of the writings of very few of the Tibetan masters in each of these lineages before the time of Dölpopa seem to have survived. The Shentong tradition in Tibet before Dölpopa. According to Tāranātha, one of the earliest Tibetan masters in the Shentong lineages based on Mahayana teachings was Drime Sherab, better known as Tsen Khawoché, born 1021, who was most intimately connected with the transmission of the highest continuum, Uttaratantra. In his important collection of 100 guiding instructions from various lineages, Kunga Drölchok preserved some instructions of this teacher, which are the earliest extant materials about the Shentong view in Tibet. Kunga Drölchok first provides some historical context. As for the guiding instructions on the view of an emptiness of other, Tsen Khawoché said, Sanjana, the Pandita of Kashmir, made this very significant statement. The conqueror turned the Dharma wheel 3 times. The first wheel taught the 4 truths, the middle one taught the lack of defining characteristics, and the final one made carefully thorough distinctions. Of these, the first 2 did not distinguish between the real and the imaginary. The final one, at the point of certainty concerning the absolute, taught by distinguishing between the middle and the extremes, and distinguishing between phenomena and true nature. Only the original manuscripts of distinguishing phenomena and true nature and the highest continuum were rediscovered. If these 2 texts had been lost, it would have indicated Maitreya's passing away into bliss. Appearing in an old notebook of Tsen Khawoché himself bearing the title Lotus Hook, this is persuasive against the later claim that the distinction of an emptiness of other was totally unknown in India and only appeared later in Tibet with the omniscient Dölpopa. Please also closely examine the statement appearing in one of the all-knowing Buton's replies to questions, where he mentions the earlier existence of the philosophical tenet of Tanakpa Rinchen Yeshe that seems to have been later enhanced and maintained by Dölpopa. Kunga Drölchok considers this statement by Tsen Khawoché to be a very important example of an early precedent for the philosophical distinctions later formulated by Dölpopa. Here Tsen Khawoché refers to his teacher Sanjana's opinion that only the third turning of the Dharma wheel, where clear distinctions are made between phenomena and true nature, represents the definitive meaning of the Buddha's teachings. Kunga Drölchok feels that this refutes Tibetan critics who claimed the Shentong view was completely unknown in India and Tibet until the time of Dölpopa. He further remarks that even the great Buton commented that Dölpopa had enhanced an earlier Tibetan philosophical tenet held by one Tanakpa Rinchen Yeshe, and directs the reader to one of Buton's written replies to questions. Unfortunately, there is no mention of Dölpopa in the replies of Buton that have been preserved. However, Dölpopa did indeed study with the Tanakh master Rinchen Yeshe. When still quite young, just before his teaching debut at Sakya in 1313, Dölpopa spent about 3 months at Tanakh, where he studied with Rinchen Yeshe and received an explanation of the 5 treatises of Maitreya, 2 of which are the highest continuum and distinguishing phenomena and true nature. The question of such important influences on Dölpopa's formulation of the Shentong view will be discussed below. The lineage of the Kala Chakra teachings transmitted in the Jonang tradition emphasize the definitive aspect of the doctrine long before the time of Dölpopa. This is most obvious in a group of short works entitled Set of 4 Bright Lamps, composed by the 11th century Kala Chakra master Yumawa Mikyo Dorje. Yumawa is clearly dealing with some of the same themes that Dölpopa later elaborated. Tāranātha even identifies Yumawa as having initiated the tradition of the philosophical tenets of Tantric Shentong. But it is very significant that none of the key terms associated with Dölpopa's theories, such as Shentong, emptiness of other, or Kunshi Yeshe, universal ground primordial awareness, appear in the extant writings of Yumawa, nor does he use the terminology that Dölpopa apparently borrowed from certain Mahayana sutras and treatises. Nevertheless, 700 years after Yumawa, the Gelug master Tuken Loseng Chokyinima, 1737 to 1802, who despised the Shentong view, says, in his crystal mirror of philosophical tenets, that Yumawa was the founder of the Shentong teachings, which he so named, and that they were passed down orally until the time of Dölpopa as a hidden doctrine without any written texts. The earlier comments of the Kagyu master Go Latsoa Shonupal, 1392 to 1481, in a letter to the Zhang ruler Rikten Namgyal Draksang, simply focus on the teachings of the Sugata essence and definitive meaning. I have a slight understanding that this Dharma language of the Sugata essence is the excellent heart of the ultimate doctrine of definitive meaning. In ancient times, most spiritual friends in central Tibet and Tsang turned away from discussion of discriminating self-awareness. The doctrine started from the great adept Yumawa's composition of the treatises of the 4 Bright Lamps. At a later time, the great omniscient Dharma Lord, Dölpopa, spread and increased it. Dölpopa actively taught Yumawa's 4 Bright Lamps, yet he neither mentions Yumawa in his own writings nor quotes directly from his texts. But the early Jonang master Kunpang Tukje Tsondru does specifically identify the 4 lamps as the crucial source of direct introduction to the essence of the 6-branch yoga of Kala Chakra. Yumawa's 4 brief treatises are ultimately concerned with the correct practice of the 6-branch yoga, the completion stage meditation system grounded in the Kala Chakra Tantra. The 4 texts focus on unity, the Great Seal, luminosity, and emptiness. A prayer to the masters in the transmission line of the Kala Chakra teachings according to the Jonang lineage is appended to the first of the 4 texts, indicating that the extant manuscript was passed down in the Jonang tradition. Yumawa discusses many tantric topics in his writings that are beyond the scope of this book. But one of his recurrent concerns is to emphasize that he does not accept the opinion of most scholars that the path consists of realizing the true mode of the existence of phenomena, or the true nature of all phenomena, to be an emptiness not established by any intrinsic nature, free from the extremes of existence, non-existence, both, and neither. He identifies this as the meaning of the view, the philosophical tenet that establishes the true mode of existence of all entities. This is not what is to be cultivated as the path according to the stages of esoteric instruction. In short, Yumawa teaches that emptiness in the context of the path of meditation absolutely must be experiential. An emptiness of any nature whatsoever cannot be directly experienced. For Yumawa, emptiness that is the valid path is experienced during the practice of the 6-branch yoga, when images of emptiness are actually beheld. This is the direct experience of emptiness as the path according to the teachings of the Kala Chakra Tantra. Yumawa says that emptiness arrived at through reasoned analysis and emptiness without mental activity are not the path. It is the emptiness seen with the eyes during meditative concentration that is the subject of his work. Concerning these images of emptiness, the Jonang master Kunpang Tukje Tsondru writes, "Precisely that is beholding the face of the divine chosen deity of the absolute true nature." Echoes of this point of view will be found in the works of Dölpopa. The texts translated in Part 2 of this book will show that the teachings of Dölpopa were solidly grounded in the doctrine of the Tantras, especially the Kala Chakra Tantra, and that his treatises do not simply follow established philosophical tenets, but represent a synthesis of the view and practice of Mahayana and Vajrayana Buddhism. 2. Dölpopa and the Shentong view. Early Tibetan masters such as Tsen Khawoché and Yumawa, who taught what was later referred to as the Shentong view, did so only to small groups in the context of private instruction. Very few texts written by any of the later members of their lineages from the 11th century until the late 13th century have survived. It was not until Dölpopa proclaimed his realization and gave his doctrine the name Shentong that this term and the teachings now associated with it became widely known in Tibet. The circumstances surrounding Dölpopa's initial proclamation of the Shentong were described in Chapter 1, and the nature of his ideas will become clear in Chapter 3 and in Part 2. Here, some of the influences behind his theories, his innovative use of language, his motivation, and the method by which he approached the Buddhist scriptures will be discussed. Dölpopa's statements show that the most important scriptural sources for his controversial theories were the set of texts known as the Bodhisattva Trilogy, which are the definitive Indian commentaries on the Kala Chakra Tantra, the Hivajra Tantra, and the Chakra Samvara Tantra. For example, in a text that he sent to the ruler of the region of Zhang, Dölpopa specifies these works as the key influences in his conversion from the view of absolute reality as an emptiness of self-nature. Of these, the stainless light of Kalki Pundarika held special significance for him. Dölpopa once remarked, "All the key points of the profound definitive meaning were discovered in the great commentary to the Kala Chakra Tantra, so it has been remarkably kind." Dölpopa was a consummate practitioner of the six-branch yoga, the completion stage practices of Kala Chakra. He based his doctrinal discussions on scripture, particularly the cycles related to the Kala Chakra Tantra, but his own experience in meditation was crucial to the formation of his theories. As George Tanabe has emphasized in his study of the Japanese master Myoe, Buddhists have long insisted that the primary experience, and experience as primary, is that of meditation and practice. Dölpopa obviously felt that he had experienced the definitive meaning of the Buddha's message that was known in the mystical land of Shambhala, but not understood in Tibet. He once claimed to have actually gone to Shambhala during an evening meditation session. The next morning, he gave an extensive teaching about the layout of Shambhala, its relation to the rest of the universe, and the esoteric instructions of the Kala Chakra Tantra. After directly beholding Shambhala, he composed eulogies to it, declaring in one that he had discovered precisely how Shambhala and Kailash exist, which was previously unknown to Indian and Tibetan scholars. When giving personal meditation advice to his students, Dölpopa most often speaks of the special knowledge he had discovered. He emphasizes that many in Shambhala understand the experiences that arise from meditation on the six-branch yoga, but no one understands in Tibet except for him. His own awareness is due solely to the kindness of the Kalki emperors. For example, he writes the following verses in an instruction to one of his disciples. "Generally, if I speak frankly, other people don't like it. If I speak what other people say, it would deceive my students. It is difficult to be a teacher nowadays. Nevertheless, I will speak frankly to you. The Kalki lives in Shambhala to the north. In the Dharma palace of Kalapa live many who understand these types of experiences. In the snowy land of Tibet, just I understand these types of experiences." And to another disciple he writes, "These days this procedure is not known by most, who are famed as scholars, who claim good meditation and high realization, and who are conceited great adepts, but I have discovered it by the kindness of the Kalki." The combination of Dölpopa's experience in meditation on the six-branch yoga, his visionary contact with the land of Shambhala and its Kalki emperors, and their special blessings, certainly provided the primary inspiration for his views. But many of the themes of interpretation that came to fruition in his teaching had been present in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet for centuries. The teachings of Tsen Khawoché and Yumawa mentioned in the previous section are just two examples of earlier Tibetan teachers whose views certainly provided a precedent for some of Dölpopa's theories. In this context, it is very interesting that some Tibetan sources also speak of the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, as a possible direct influence on Dölpopa, or even as the first adherent to the Shentong. The earliest available account of the meeting between these two teachers is by the 16th century Sakya master Mangte Ludrup Gyatso. Moreover, this lord Dölpopa met with Karma Rangjung Dorje, and it is said when Dölpopa upheld the philosophical tenet of the emptiness of self-nature, the Karmapa prophesied that he would later become an adherent of the emptiness of other. In general, I think the tradition of the emptiness of other was first upheld by Karma Rangjung Dorje. Those at Jonang became adherents to the emptiness of other after the great omniscient Dölpopa. According to Tāranātha, This meeting seems to have taken place when Dölpopa was 29 or 30 years old, just prior to his trip to Jonang to meet Yönten Gyatso in 1322. Then Dölpopa traveled to Lhasa, Tsurpu, and so forth. He had many discussions about Dharma with Dharma Lord Rangjung. Rangjung could not match the scriptural reasoning of this lord, but he had fine clairvoyance and prophesied, "You will soon have a view, practice, and Dharma language much better than this that you have now." Tāranātha apparently quotes from the Karmapa's prophecy, but makes no mention of him as a possible source for Dölpopa's development of the Shentong view. Unfortunately, no record of this meeting is found in the early biographies of either teacher. However, a later history of the Karma Kamtsang tradition, written by Situpanchen Chokyi Jungne, 1700 to 1774, specifies that Dölpopa still adhered to the view of an emptiness of self-nature at the time of the meeting. According to the chronology of this work, the meeting between the two masters occurred between 1320 and 1324. One of the most innovative aspects of Dölpopa's philosophical approach was his development of a new Dharma language to express a wide range of themes found in Mahayana and Vajrayana scripture. Tāranātha mentions that when Dölpopa first taught the Shentong, he wrote a number of texts containing a certain Dharma language that was incomprehensible to many scholars, who upon reading them experienced a state of what might be called hermeneutical shock. As just mentioned, Karmapa Rangjung Dorje also prophesied that Dölpopa would soon develop a new and superior terminology. Dölpopa did two things with language that were largely unprecedented in Tibet. Much research remains to be done, but it is probable that he first developed a special terminology or Dharma language that involved the appropriation of key terms from Mahayana sutras and treatises, terms that were acceptable in their original context within scripture, but were almost never used in ordinary scholarly discourse. Then he created, or at least made first extensive use of, several Tibetan terms such as Shentong, emptiness of other, and Kunchi Yeshe, universal ground primordial awareness, to express scriptural themes he wished to emphasize. He also drew into his vocabulary some key terms such as Uma Chenpo, great Madhyamaka, that had been in use in Tibet for centuries but are not found in any Indian scriptures or commentaries. In the second phase, he employed what may be referred to as source-alien terminology, utilizing previously unknown terms to explicate ideas and themes already present in many Buddhist scriptures. In his unique use of language, Dölpopa first borrowed loaded terminology from Mahayana sutras and treatises and incorporated it into his own compositions. A few examples will illustrate this unusual facet of his work. One of the controversial points in his teaching is the assertion that ultimate truth, referred to by terms such as Sugata Garbha, Sugata essence, Dharmadhatu, basic space of phenomena, and Dharmakaya, Dharma body, is permanent or eternal. Statements to this effect are certainly not unusual in many Mahayana sutras and treatises, but for most scholars in Tibet, the hermeneutical approach was to view those statements as provisional, nayartha, and in need of interpretation. For Dölpopa, such statements in the scriptures and commentaries were of definitive meaning, nitartha, and to be understood literally. He began to freely use the terminology of these scriptures in a way suggesting that no interpretation was required, and this was no doubt shocking. For instance, the Tibetan terms Dag, Atman, Tagpa, Nitya, and Tenpa, Dhruva, as well as other terms used to translate the Sanskrit Shashvata, are found in the Tibetan translations of treatises such as the Highest Continuum and sutras such as the Lankavatara, Ganavyuha, Angulimalya, Srimala, and Mahaparinirvana, where they are used to describe the Dharmakaya, the Tathagata, and the Buddha nature, or Sugata essence. These terms, which can be translated as self, permanent, stable, everlasting, eternal, and indestructible, are used by Dölpopa throughout his writings, not just when discussing the meaning of a passage in Scripture. Bhutan Rinchen Drup's refutations of the Jonang interpretation of these very terms as used in Scripture clearly shows that this was one of the areas where Dölpopa's contemporaries reacted strongly. In one of Dölpopa's early and brief compositions, General Commentary on the Doctrine, which is considered a major work, most of these terms from the sutras in Indian treatises are already in use. In another early and important text, Exceptional Esoteric Instructions on Madhyamaka, which he wrote at the request of his teacher, Sonam Drakpa, several of these terms are also found, and some of the themes he would later develop are present in embryonic form. The crucial terms continue to be found in all of his later writings. In his last major works, the Fourth Council and its auto-commentary, Dölpopa frequently uses all the terms listed above, as well as other unusual compounds such as eternal kaya. Dölpopa never dated his major works, but it may be possible in the future to establish an approximate chronology of his writings through analysis of the terminology used in the different texts. For example, general commentary on the doctrine and exceptional esoteric instructions on the Madhyamaka do not contain the terms shentong or kunshi yeshe. This gives the impression that they are very early works and that the borrowing of vocabulary from scriptural sources, which is present in these works, was the first step in the evolution of his use of terminology, later to be followed by the creation of his own Dharma language. The term shentong is most often associated with Dölpopa, who is usually thought to have coined it. However, there is some evidence of at least a few isolated occurrences of the term before his time. Dölpopa himself quotes a master called Lord Poripa, who makes a statement that could have come from Dölpopa. Relative truth is empty of self-nature, and absolute truth is empty of other. If the mode of emptiness of the two truths is not understood, in this way there is danger of denying complete Buddhahood. This is certainly the most significant occurrence of the term by a writer who may predate Dölpopa, but very little is known about any earlier master called Poripa. The single possible identification is with the obscure early Kagyu teacher Poriwa Konchok Gyaltsen. Another example of the use of the term shentong is found in the biography of Ra Lotsawa Dorje Drak, 11th to 12th centuries, who contrasts it to the term rangtong in a mystical song. But there are strong reasons to conclude that this biography was extensively reworked in the 17th century, and so the occurrence of the term is probably not significant. Dölpopa's contemporary, the famous Nyingma master Longchen Rabjampa, also mentions the term when discussing the three-nature, Trisvabhava theory of the Yogacara tradition. He contrasts the three categories of empty of self-nature, Ranggitongpa, empty of other, Shengitongpa, and empty of both, Nikke-tongpa, but with none of the connotations inherent in Dölpopa's usage. During a discussion of the Buddha nature, the expression shentong is also used once in a text attributed to Padmasambhava in the Heart Drop of the Dakinis, which was revealed in the 13th century by Pema Lendrel Tsel. Once again, the usage of the term is not similar to that found in Dölpopa's works. This evidence shows that the term shentong had been used in Tibet before the time of Dölpopa, albeit only in isolated instances. The tradition itself certainly considers him as the one who coined the term, but it is perhaps more accurate to say Dölpopa made use of an obscure term that had very limited use before him and gave it a place of fundamental importance in the expression of his philosophy. Another central theme of Dölpopa's thought is the contrasting of universal ground consciousness, kunshi namshe, and universal ground primordial awareness, kunshi yeshe. The term kunshi yeshe is not found in the writings of any earlier Tibetan authors, and Dölpopa includes it in a list of topics previously unknown in Tibet that he had realized and explicated. The phrase mirror-like universal ground primordial awareness, kunshi melong tawe yeshe, is found in one of the works of Longchen Rabjampa, where he uses it to characterize the Dharmakaya and contrast it with the universal ground consciousness as one of the 8 modes of consciousness. In this one instance, there are some similarities with Dölpopa's ideas, but Longchenpa's usual position is to identify the universal ground, kunshi, only with impure states of mind. Until 1322, when he was 30 years old, Dölpopa had primarily studied Buddhist literature, philosophy, and practice according to the Sakya tradition. For most of the previous decade, he had studied and taught at Sakya Monastery itself. He would certainly have been very familiar with the works of Sakya Pandita Kunga Gyaltsen, 1182 to 1251, such as distinguishing the 3 vows, which are fundamental to the education of a Sakya scholar and practitioner. The similarities between Sakya Pandita's statements about his motives for composing his controversial works and Dölpopa's statements about his own motives are as striking as the fact that the 2 masters were at opposite ends of the spectrum of doctrinal interpretation. An example of Dölpopa's familiarity with Sakya Pandita's work and his sympathy for the Sakya master's sentiments is found at the end of the auto-commentary to the Fourth Council. Dölpopa takes a couplet directly from distinguishing the 3 vows, and then extends Sakya Pandita's metaphor by repeating it in a series of verses. The gist of Sakya Pandita's verse is that no matter how many traditions of Dharma there may be, If they are not linked to an authentic source, they are lifeless, like gaming pieces that are off the board and irrelevant. Dölpopa uses the first couplet of Sakya Pandita's verse as a point of departure and, through its repetition, addresses a number of related issues. For example, he says there may be numerous teachings of the degenerate Treta Yuga, but if they are not linked to the perfect Krita Yuga, they are lifeless, like dead bodies. He continues in this vein, contrasting the fully established nature with the imagined nature, the absolute with the relative, emptiness of self-nature with emptiness of other, and so forth. This borrowing was certainly deliberate and would have called to mind the themes and tone of Sakya Pandita's treatise, especially since it was one of his descendants, Lama Dampa Sonam Gyaltsen, who had requested Dölpopa to compose the Fourth Council in its auto-commentary. Some of Dölpopa's clearest comments about his motives and sentiments are found at the end of his brief analysis, which he sent to the ruler of the Principality of Zhang to explain his doctrinal views. It is a significant spiritual and autobiographical testament. These investigations lay a plumb line straight upon reality's true mode of being, just as it is. They are not contaminated with impurities such as prejudice, partiality, and the notion that a claim is stronger just because it was made earlier. I have taken as witnesses the opinions of the omniscient Buddha, the Blessed One, the excellent lords on the 10th level, such as the lords of the three families, Vajragarbha and Maitreyanatha, the great founders and excellent realized experts, such as Noble Asanga, the great Brahmin Saraha, and the great Pandita Naropa. I have avoided exaggeration and denial and have written after fully comprehending their intentions exactly as they are. You might think you are arrogant about having realized their intentions exactly as they are, but do your ideas actually disagree with those of other Tibetan teachers because you have not realized them? That is not the case. The causes for not understanding are certainly inferior intelligence, lacking the oral instructions of an excellent master, little study, no experience and realization in meditation, being filled with pride and arrogance, defining true and false on the basis of the notion that a claim is stronger just because it was made earlier, popularity, and so forth. But I first engaged in much study of the great scriptural traditions. Then I engaged in the practice of the oral instructions of India and Tibet that are known to be profound. And then the precise experience and realization of each of them actually arose. Then, based on the infusion of a little of the blessing of having encountered the definitive meaning of the great root tantras, the oral instructions of glorious Kalapa, the profound uncommon heartfelt advice of the Kalkis on the 10th level, I discovered many profound key points that have not been discovered, have not been realized, and have not been fully comprehended by self-clinging panditas, most dedicated meditators endowed with experience and realization, and most who are arrogant about being great upholders of secret mantra. A fine realization burst forth from within. Therefore, not only most dedicated meditators endowed with experience and realization, and those who are arrogant about being great upholders of secret mantra, but even the Buddha definitely could not turn me back from this truth, because I have an exceptional certainty with no doubts to ask about. You might also think all that certainty is from blurred and dim meditation or from misunderstanding. You have no perfect scriptural quotations for proof. That is not lacking, because there are very many clear quotations, together with reasoning and with esoteric instructions from those on the 12th level, those on the 10th level, and excellent realized experts such as Nagarjuna and his spiritual sons, and the great Pandita Naropa. Nevertheless, I have not written them here from fear of being verbose, but if you wish and are so interested, I will write and offer them later. Of these points, several exceptional ones certainly disagree with some that have been known in Tibet before. But you have been accustomed to an earlier philosophical tenet for a long time, so the propensity for it has become firm, and many in Tibet adhere to that tradition. So there is certainly a difference of firm and unstable propensities for these previous and later philosophical tenets, and a difference in the number of adherents. However, without giving in to the influence of those differences, please take as witnesses the scriptures of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, and examine them with an attitude of unbiased honesty as to which system is true. As this and many other passages make clear, considerable opposition to Dölpopa's theories certainly arose. Specifically, he felt that most people had already closed their minds to the teachings of definitive meaning. The mistaken notion that a claim is stronger just because it was made earlier, and the prejudice inherent in the established traditions of his time were some of the greatest factors inhibiting the widespread acceptance of his ideas. He was presenting his case to a prejudiced jury. It is therefore curious that not a single contemporary text has survived in which hostile testimony against Dölpopa is preserved. Perhaps full reaction to his doctrine did not develop and gain open expression until after his death. 3. The Shentong tradition after Dölpopa. Dölpopa was surrounded by a group of experts as formidable as any in 14th century Tibet. His most influential successors in the Jonang tradition were probably Choklé Namgyal, Nyaön Kungapal, and Mati Panchen Lodro Gyaltsen. Important works by all these masters are extant and demonstrate the extent to which they followed Dölpopa's example concerning crucial doctrinal issues. In particular, it was apparently the teachings of Choklé Namgyal and Nyaön that provoked polemic responses and negative reactions. The most famous and influential early opponent of the Jonang tradition was the Sakya master Rendawa Shono Lodro, 1348 to 1413, who was also one of the most important teachers of the great Tsongkhapa Losang Drakpa, 1357 to 1419. Rendawa is generally credited with establishing the Prasangika form of Madhyamaka philosophy in Tibet, but he came to be viewed by the Jonang tradition as a vicious opponent of the teachings of definitive meaning so successfully spread by Dölpopa. For example, a pseudo-prophecy said to be Dölpopa's last testament, but surely composed much later by a Jonang follower and added to his biography, describes Rendawa as an evil demon who would spread the view of nihilism. Moreover, he would refute the doctrine of the Buddha nature, or Sugata essence, as the ultimate ground, deny the six-branch yoga as the ultimate path, and deny the existence of the ultimate result as a separation from all taints. He would also criticize the Kala Chakra root tantra because it did not begin with the words, "Thus have I heard," as do other sutras and tantras, and would make various criticisms of the condensed Kala Chakra tantra. Finally, he would gather copies of the stainless light and have them thrown into rivers. These are serious allegations, but are also tainted with a considerable degree of hysteria. Rendawa's biography specifically points out that he was famous in Tibet for having said that the Kala Chakra Tantra was not Dharma, but that this was incorrect. While he did see internal contradictions in a literal reading of the Kala Chakra, he did not dismiss it as a non-Buddhist teaching. Rendawa makes this clear at the end of the Jewel Garland, the text where he voiced his objections to specific points in the Kala Chakra Tantra. Nevertheless, while it may or may not have been composed by a noble one, seeing that it also has many fine explanations, I have not denied this totally by saying it is not an entryway for those who wish liberation. Rendawa's main quarrel was not actually with the content of the Kala Chakra Tantra itself, but with the prevalent practice of understanding its words literally. This is specified in his Reply to Questions, a text in which he specifically defends the Kala Chakra Tantra against some of his own earlier objections. Nowadays, arrogant scholars in the land of glacial mountain ranges have become conceptually attached to the literal meaning of the words in the Kala Chakra Tantra and its commentary, which present the profound by means of implicit language. After seeing the spread of many wrong distinctions that contradict the collection of pure sutras and tantras, I have written this by means of objection and analysis, as though straightening a crooked stick. Rendawa is indeed the most famous or infamous critic of the Kala Chakra tradition in Tibet, but he had first studied with some of Dölpopa's major disciples, such as Nyaön Kungapal and Mati Panchen, and being extremely impressed with the Jonang philosophical tenets, he then decided to fully investigate the fundamental Indian texts emphasized by his Jonang teachers, such as the Kala Chakra Tantra, the Lankavatara Sutra, Maitreya's Highest Continuum, Nagarjuna's Eulogy to the Basic Space of Phenomena, and so on. He analyzed these works 3 times. After the first reading, he was certain that the Jonang position was correct. On the second reading, he became uncertain as to whether it was correct or incorrect. After the third reading, he was sure that the Jonang interpretations were incorrect. Rendawa then went to Sakya and reported to another of his teachers, the great abbot Sangye Pel, that he had decided the Jonang doctrine was wrong, and his conclusion was encouraged. He then apparently embarked on a crusade to discredit the Jonang tradition and call into question the internal contradictions he perceived in a literal reading of the Kala Chakra Tantra. First, he sent a message to his teacher, Nyaön, telling him what he had decided. Nyaön was very displeased at this reversal in Rendawa's view. Nevertheless, Rendawa felt that because of Nyaön's great intellectual powers and specifically his consummate knowledge of epistemology, he could be convinced that the Jonang view was wrong if Rendawa could demonstrate this through reasoning and scriptural quotations. He was sure that once Nyaön was converted, all the other members of the Jonang tradition would change their views. Nyaon is certainly portrayed here as one of the leading proponents of Dölpopa's teachings. However, when Rendawa went to Tsechen Monastery to speak to Nyaon, his old teacher indicated his displeasure in many ways, and Rendawa recognized there was no point in broaching the subject. Instead, he returned to Sakya and composed the Jewel Garland, his famous critique of the Kalachakra Tantra. In front of a huge assembly presided over by Drung Shitokpa, 1339 to 1399, at Sakya, Rendawa debated against the Kagyu scholar Karma Kunshun, born 1333, on the question of internal contradictions in the Kalachakra Tantra. Then he was invited to Jonang itself, where he debated on the status of the Buddha nature. According to Rendawa's biography, he was successful in converting many Jonang monks, caused others to doubt their views, and prevented still others from joining the Jonang tradition. In short, he seems to have led a strong reactionary movement against the Jonang philosophical tenets less than 30 years after the death of Dölpopa. Rendawa's Jewel Garland provoked a series of written refutations, beginning with a harsh rebuttal by the master Jangchup Senge, who succeeded Chogyal Namgyal on the monastic seat of Jonang in 1381. In the 15th century, Rikden Namgyal Draksang, the Sakya teacher Taktsang Lotsawa Sherab Rinchen, and the Kagyu master Go Lotsawa Shonupal all wrote further refutations of Rendawa's work. Nevertheless, it is now clear that Rendawa's attitude was considerably more ambivalent than the account in Tibetan historical sources. In the latter part of his life, he lived in semi-seclusion at a hermitage in the region of Gangbule. During this time, he composed his most substantial work on the Kalachakra Tantra, entitled Jewel Lamp Illuminating the Definitive Meaning of the Glorious Kalachakra. Unlike his two earlier polemic works, the first of which was certainly written while Rendawa was not yet 30 years of age, this fascinating treatise is a thorough and positive analysis of the Kalachakra meditation practices. The text is obviously an attempt to extract the profound essence of these teachings while correcting some errors of interpretation made by others. In light of Rendawa's reputation as an opponent of the Jonang tradition and a critic of the Kalachakra Tantra, it is shocking to find the following passage in this final work. According to the tradition of this Tantra, the classification of the two truths is like this. All the phenomena of the incidental stains that arise from the confusing circumstances of ignorance are relative truth, because they obscure the perception of thatness and are reference points for total affliction. Because that is also not established as the object of a perfect primordial awareness, it is empty of self-nature, a nihilistic emptiness, and an inanimate emptiness. All the phenomena of luminosity, the nature of original mind, are absolute truth, and not because it has been proven able to withstand reasoned analysis. It is the absolute because it is a non-conceptual field of experience. Because the incidental stains are absent, it is empty of other, and because it is experienced through a discriminating self-awareness, it is not a nihilistic emptiness and an inanimate emptiness. Because the emptiness of self-nature falls into the extreme of nihilism, its realization is not the perfect path of liberation. Only the emptiness of other, the true nature of mind, luminosity, and immutable inner pure awareness experienced through the force of meditation and through a discriminating self-awareness is accepted as the perfect path. Could Rendawa have actually come to accept that the definitive meaning of the Kalachakra Tantra was compatible with the Shentong view held by the Jonang tradition? Nevertheless, at other points in this important text, he continues to strongly condemn the notion of a permanent and eternal absolute reality, which he equates with the teachings of the Vedic scriptures. Without a more careful study of Rendawa's works, it is difficult to know how he was able to admit the validity of the Shentong in the context of the definitive view of the Kalachakra Tantra, but reject the various other aspects of the theory, such as the permanent and eternal status of the Buddha nature. In any case, it is certain that later generations in Tibet continued to view Rendawa as a determined enemy of both the Jonang tradition and the teachings of the Kalachakra Tantra, despite the evidence to the contrary in his final work on the subject. Even with such doctrinal backlash against the Jonang tradition in the late 14th century, Dölpopa's legacy remained powerful for many decades in the province of Tsang before other influences gained the upper hand. Tāranātha later remarked that the prophecy about Dölpopa found in the Sutra of the Great Drum was correct, since the practice of the six-branch yoga that he spread throughout Tibet and the teaching of the sutras on the essence, the highest continuum, and other key texts of the third turning of the Dharma wheel that proclaimed the Buddha nature remained strong in all teaching institutes for more than 80 years. After that point, Tāranātha said, the teaching of those scriptures was not as influential as before because many people became obsessed with the provisional meaning and having the highest view, as well as gaining reputation, power, and large entourages. This is clearly a negative reference to the rise of the Gelug tradition founded by Lord Tsongkhapa, whose main disciples, Kedrup Gelek Palsang, 1385 to 1438, and Gyaltsep Dharma Rinchen, 1364 to 1431, led the attack against the Jonang tradition in the 15th century. Nevertheless, Tāranātha continued, even around the beginning of the 17th century, the practice of the six-branch yoga, and the teachings on the Buddha nature had still managed to survive. From the period after Dölpopa's immediate disciples up until the time of Kunga Drölchok, 1507 to 1566, very few texts are available that were written by Jonang masters concerned with the Shentong view and other issues raised by Dölpopa, and Kunga Drölchok just mentions the Shentong in a few of his texts. This situation would change only with the writings of Tāranātha, who began to revive the tradition around the beginning of the 17th century. For this period of almost 200 years from the beginning of the 15th century until the beginning of the 17th century, most available information about the Jonang tradition and the Shentong teachings is thus found in polemic writings from other traditions, nearly all hostile, with the notable exception of the Sakya master Serdok Panchen Shakya Chogden, 1428 to 1507. Presently available sources portray Shakya Chogden as one of the most influential advocates of the Shentong in the 15th and early 16th centuries. This impression is strengthened by Tāranātha, who composed a fascinating text about 21 differences in the views of Dölpopa and Shakya Chogden concerning profound points of Mahayana and Vajrayana doctrine. In the late 18th century, the Gelug critic, Tuken Losang Chokye Nyima, does not mention any Shentong masters after Dölpopa's direct disciples until he singles out Shakya Chogden with particular venom. This role as an important upholder of the Shentong view, although somewhat different than that of the Jonang tradition, is all the more remarkable because Shakya Chogden was, with the possible exception of Goram Sonam Sengye, 1429 to 1489, the greatest Sakya scholar of his time. Where did Shakya Chogden come in contact with the Shentong teachings, and how did he remain a staunch Sakya master while upholding this view? There is not total agreement about the source of the Shentong received by Shakya Chogden. One of his main teachers was the Sakya master Rongton Sheja Kunrik, 1367 to 1449. The modern Tibetan scholar Dongtok Rinpoche says Shakya Chogden followed the example of his teacher Rongton in professing the Shentong in secret and refuting the exegetical tradition of Lord Tsongkhapa through logical reasoning. While Rongton's views cannot be examined in detail here, there is probably some truth to Dongtok Rinpoche's statement. For example, a eulogy to Dölpopa composed by Rongton has survived, which at least indicates that this prominent Sakya teacher had great respect for Dölpopa and his views. In the Kagyu tradition, the seventh Karmapa, Chodrak Gyatso, 1454 to 1506, is said to have inspired Shakya Chogden to accept the Shentong point of view. As previously mentioned, the third Karmapa, Rangjung Dorje, is sometimes named as an influence on Dölpopa's initial development of the Shentong teachings. At the present stage of research, the dynamics of how the Shentong came to be accepted by many members of the Kagyu tradition, especially in the Karma Kamtsang branch, is not well understood, but it was certainly a powerful force within this lineage, perhaps from the time of the third Karmapa. The earliest available source on the life of Shakya Chogden, written by Jonang Kunga Drölchok, says he met Karmapa Chodrak Gyatso on 2 occasions, but contains no mention of the Shentong or similar topics. These meetings can be dated to the year 1502. The most significant event was the second meeting at the Rinpong court of Donyo Dorje, who was the most powerful ruler in Tibet. According to the Kagyu historian Pawo Tsuklak Trengwa, 1504 to 1566, who was writing between the years 1545 and 1564, about 20 to 30,000 people are said to have gathered from throughout the Tsang region to welcome the Karmapa on his arrival in Rinpong. Shakya Chogden stayed with the Karmapa for about 1 month. During this period, he received many of the Kagyu hierarchs' uncommon profound instructions, which greatly enhanced his experience of renunciation and realization in meditation, and caused him to accept the Karmapa as his main master. An 18th century history of the Karma Kagyu tradition elaborates further, saying that the Karmapa accorded Shakya Chogden the incredible honor of sitting on a throne of equal height in the midst of the assembly, and that they spent the month in discussion of the most profound topics. On this occasion, the Karmapa said his mind and Shakya Chokden's mind had blended into a single mind stream. A passage later in the same work finally mentions that in his writings, Shakya Chokden accepted, as did the Karmapa, that the ultimate view of the two great traditions of the Mahayana was the Shentong view of the Absolute as only empty of other relative phenomena. Shakya Chokden was already 73 or 74 years old, but this event is often considered to have been the deciding factor in his acceptance of the Shentong. However, it now seems more likely that Shakya Chokden had upheld the Shentong view for many years, and that this lengthy discussion with the Karmapa was more of a further validation and enrichment of his realization than a change of view. If this were not the case, it would have to be accepted that all his works dealing with an emptiness of self-nature and an emptiness of other were composed in the last 5 years of his life. In addition to Shakya Chokden's biography, Kunga Drölchok also wrote a biography of Rigten Namgyal Dröchok, 1395 to 1475, the great ruler of the region of Zhang, who was a master physician and scholar. Namgyal Dröchok studied with many teachers of different traditions, but described himself as a follower of the Jonang teachings, especially those of the Kala Chakra and the six-branch yoga, and considered Dölpopa to be the ultimate authority on these topics. Like Dölpopa before him, Namgyal Dröchok was believed to be an emanation of the Shambhala emperor Kalki Pundarika, and wrote many important works, but very few seem to have survived. Shakya Chokden and Namgyal Dröchok corresponded by letter and met on several occasions. Their last meeting was in 1475 at the elderly ruler's residence near Namring, which Shakya Chokden visited on his return trip from a lengthy stay in Mustang, in present-day Nepal. During this visit, the sovereign master, who passed away soon after, resolved all Shakya Chokden's remaining doubts and questions about the stainless light, the great commentary on the Kala Chakra Tantra. Shakya Chokden also received initiation in the mandala of the Mahasamvara form of Kala Chakra from Namgyal Dröchok and accepted him as his sublime Vajra master. In this specific context, Kunga Drölchok quotes Shakya Chokden at length concerning his early interest in the great Madhyamaka and the teachings of definitive meaning. When he was a child, Shakya Chokden once accompanied his teacher, Dönya Palwa, on a visit to the great scholar Khenchen Pema Sangpo. This teacher stressed that the 5 treatises of Maitreya were all great Madhyamaka, which was different from what Dönya Palwa accepted. In Shakya Chokden's own words, Pema Sangpo looked at me and said, "Wise young nephew, closely investigate topics such as this," and also gave me a gift of tea. After that time, I closely investigated the definitive meaning, but did not really record it in great detail in treatises strictly devoted to the works of the philosophical tenets. I just spoke of it a little bit in conversation. Later, because I received the command of the great Rigten Namgyal Dröchok, I have specifically emphasized it. Kunga Drölchok further notes that Shakya Chokden spoke of this often in the monastic assembly, and that if his works written before the trip to Mostang in Ngari and the works he wrote after that time are carefully examined with the eye of wisdom, certainty about this distinction will arise. Kunga Drölchok was the greatest upholder of Shakya Chokden's transmission of the Sakya teachings, and these quotations and comments clearly point to the Jonang master Namgyal Dröchok as the key influence in Shakya Chokden's decision to openly write about the Shentong, or teachings of definitive meaning, during the last 32 years of his life. It seems significant that Kunga Drölchok does not refer to any Sakya or Kagyu influences on Shakya Chokden's views. The works of Shakya Chokden were later banned in Tibet during the middle of the 17th century. Bigoted supporters of the Gelug tradition, who held political power, sealed the printery where the blocks for his writings were kept, and ordered copies of his works to be confiscated. But a unique manuscript of his collected writings survived in Bhutan and was finally published more than 300 years later. The banning of Shakya Chokden writings in Tibet no doubt had a lasting effect on the later doctrinal development of the Sakya tradition. Shakya Chokden's works often focus on a theme of reconciliation and synthesis between traditions that have become polarized over doctrinal issues. His brand of Shentong differs in many respects from that of Dölpopa, although they agree about the ultimate import of the view. In one brief work, Shakya Chokden compares the views of Dölpopa and Buton, both of whom he considers to be Sakya, and comes to the startling conclusion that, in the ultimate sense, there is no basis for disagreement between the Jonang and Shalu traditions concerning emptiness of self-nature and emptiness of other, because in the context of the definitive meaning of the Tantras, Bhutan's tradition also accepted the view of the emptiness of other. the theme of synthesis, or at least accepting an absence of contradiction between these two points of view, was also the approach of the seventh Karmapa, Chodruk Gyatso, as recorded by his disciple Karma Trinlepa, 1456 to 1539. The text that best exemplifies this is Karma Trinlepa's brief versified response to some written questions he had received. This work, which must surely be the one mentioned 200 years later by Belo Tsewang Kunkyap as the brief treatise that shows there is no contradiction between an emptiness of self-nature and an emptiness of other, specifically summarizes the view of the seventh Karmapa on this topic. As several modern writers have already noted, the eighth Karmapa, Mikyo Dorje, 1507 to 1554, also wrote a text on the Shentong view, although later in his life he changed his mind and wrote refutations of Dölpopa and Shakya Chokden. The yogin Shongchen Tenpe Gyaltsen, who lived in the 16th or 17th century, also wrote an interesting short text attempting to bring the views of an emptiness of self-nature and an emptiness of other into harmony. Shongchen was responsible for codifying the teachings on severance, Chod, that had been passed down in an oral transmission from the great adept Tangtong Gyalpo, 1361 to 1485, who claimed to be the rebirth of Dölpopa. Shongchen's work is a versified presentation of the key points involved in the philosophical tenets of Great Madhyamaka. From the late 15th century through the late 16th century, the Sakya position concerning the Jonang teachings of the Shentong and related topics is extremely complex. With the exception of Shakya Chokden and Gorampa, only a handful of writings by Sakya masters of the period are available that specifically discuss these issues. However, a number of brief passages in biographies and some minor texts give indications of the situation. Important information is found in the biographies of Gorampa Kunga Lekpa, 1477 to 1544, who held the monastic seat of Jonang for many years, while he was also a leading exponent of the Sakya teachings of the path with the result. Lamdre, the great Tsarchen Losel Gyatso, 1502 to 1566, who was the most highly regarded master of the path with the result in the 16th century and who received many teachings from Gorampa, Jonang Kunga Drölchok, who was the main holder of Panchen Shakya Chokden's lineage of Sakya explication and practice, and Jamyang Chense Wangchuk, 1524 to 1568, who studied with all three of these masters. The biography of Gorampa is a major source regarding the situation at the great hermitage of Jonang from the late 15th century to the middle of the 16th century. The Jonang tradition was still obviously strong in the Tsang region, and Dölpopa's major treatises such as the Mountain Dharma, the Fourth Council and its auto-commentary, and the general commentary on the doctrine were being transmitted and studied at Jonang. In 1516, Gorampa ascended the throne at Jonang and held the monastic seat there until 1527. During this time, and during the tenure of his hand-picked successor, Namkha Palsang, who held the position from 1527 to 1543, Dölpopa's teachings of definitive meaning were preserved without any corruption. Gorampa taught not only the Jonang specialties, but many tantric instructions of the Sakya tradition, such as the path with the result. During these years, he was clearly a prominent example of what must have not been an uncommon situation: the practice and study of both Jonang and Sakya teachings without any serious obstacles to such an approach. Gorampa seems to now be remembered only in the Sakya tradition. Kunga Drölchok is one of the most famous masters of the Jonang tradition. Like Dölpopa, more than 200 years earlier, he was born in a region, Mustang, that is now inside the borders of Nepal, was raised and educated in the Sakya tradition, and then traveled to Tibet for advanced studies. He first received teachings in Tibet from major disciples of Panchen Shakya Chokden at the Sakya monastery of Serdokchen, and later visited other regions and received a vast number of teachings from masters of every lineage. Kunga Drölchok was particularly attracted to the teachings of the 6 dharmas of Niguma in the Shangpa tradition, which he practiced and taught very widely. He received the Jonang transmissions of the Kalachakra Tantra and the 6-branch yoga from the master Lochen Ratnabhadra, 1489 to 1563, who became one of his most important teachers. Kunga Drölchok was invited to take the monastic seat of Jonang in the middle of the 16th century and become the leader of the tradition. Before making a decision, he traveled to Jonang to offer prayers in front of the image of the omniscient Dölpopa. Just as Kunga Drölchok's name was read out 3 times by one of the masters in attendance, an earthquake occurred which caused all the bells on the great stupa of Jonang to jingle. Kunga Drölchok felt that this was a perfect omen, indicating the spread of the teachings of definitive meaning, and immediately wrote out his letter of acceptance. In one of his autobiographical writings, he says he was now able to partially benefit the Jonang tradition because, in a previous lifetime, he had been a fellow student, along with Dölpopa, at Sakya Monastery. Receiving many tantric teachings together from the master Kyuton Jamyang Dragpa, they became Vajra brothers bound by the sacred commitments. Kunga Drölchok's extensive autobiographies, his 100 guiding instructions of Jonang, and his other miscellaneous works show that he was authentically unbiased and truly represented many lineages. The three main systems of tantric practice most important to him were the esoteric instructions of the Shangpa Kagyu, the Jonang tradition of the six-branch yoga, and the Sakya practices of the path with the result. He constantly bestowed these teachings throughout his life. In the present context, what is striking is the apparent lack of any strong attempt to spread the Shentong view of Dölpopa. Kunga Drölchok seems to have been more interested in creating an atmosphere of tolerance for all lineages of explication and practice than furthering that of only one. This is also perhaps indicative of the situation in which the Jonang tradition now found itself. Since the time of Dölpopa, the great majority of Sakya teachers had increasingly distanced themselves from the Jonang view and doctrinal position. But there was not such a rift between the two traditions concerning practice, as illustrated by the presence of four great Jonang masters in the lineage of the Sakya teachings of the path with the result. The writings of both Shakya Chogden and Kunga Drölchok show that many members of the Sakya tradition during the 15th and 16th centuries were influenced by the unique views of Lord Tsongkhapa, whose supporters had continued to increase in number. Quite a few Sakya scholars after Rendawa had rejected the theories of Dölpopa and apparently adopted views more compatible with the new Gelug tradition of Rendawa's disciple, Lord Tsongkhapa, even though Tsongkhapa's theories were very questionable in light of the ancient teachings of the original Sakya masters. Shakya Chogden and Kunga Drölchok refer to this trend among some Sakya followers as the lately arisen Sakya tradition, and discuss a tension between the new and old Sakya traditions, especially in regard to the teachings of the path with the result. They saw this new development as a serious corruption of the teachings of the original Sakya founders, whose ultimate intentions they felt were closer to those of the Jonang tradition than those of the Gelug. Kunga Drölchok saw these adherents to a new Sakya movement as wolves in sheep's clothing, who were destroying the true Sakya teachings. In short, they were Gelug followers masquerading as members of the Sakya tradition. On the other hand, some Sakya followers may also have been attracted to the Shentong orientation precisely in order to counteract the dominant Gelug influence in Tibetan politics and religion. One of Kunga Drölchok's great strengths is an exceptional ability to focus on the specific teachings of a given lineage without being influenced by those of other lineages, even the Jonang tradition he represented. If he is writing about the Sakya teachings of the path with the result, he carefully distinguishes its view from that of traditions that have different approaches. And when discussing the Jonang teachings of the six-branch yoga, he keeps precisely to Dölpopa's interpretation as the ultimate authority. In the latter context, he once referred to himself as Dölpopa, the embodiment of the Buddhas of the past, present, and future, once again returned to sit on his teaching throne and preserve his tradition. As the physical embodiment of the three regal masters and the single protector of mother living beings in the three realms, wasn't Sherab Gyaltsen the name of the glorious Dölpopa, embodiment of the Buddhas of the three times? Sitting on that Lord's Dharma throne and maintaining that Lord's tradition, am I not the Yogin Rangdrol, the Lord Buddha from Dölpo, returned again? When teaching instructions in a lineage that came from Dölpopa, Kunga Drölchok did not hesitate to use terminology reminiscent of his great predecessor, speaking of the great kingdom of natural luminosity, the permanent and stable stone mountain of the basic space of phenomena, and the immutable and permanent kaya of primordial awareness. Jonang was flourishing during this period. Tsarchen Losel Gyatso, considered the greatest Sakya master of Tantra in the 16th century, received the Jonang instructions of the six-branch yoga from Gurumpa, as well as many Sakya teachings of the path with the result. In 1539, Tsarchen visited Jonang and, reminiscent of Dölpopa's initial experience there, looked up at the stone meditation huts on the mountainside and was filled with awe at the tradition of continuous meditation retreat that had been maintained there. The next morning, we visited the great stupa that liberates on sight, the temple of the lineage of the six-branch yoga, and so forth. When I gazed from afar at the hermitages, my mind went out to them, and I was enthralled. A distinctly vivid, pure vision dawned in the center of my heart, and I thought, the early excellent masters established a continuous meditation center in a site such as this. Placing many people on the path of liberation, their way of life was so amazing and so incredible. When will we also practice for enlightenment in an isolated site such as this? Tsarchin visited Jonang 2 years later when a model of the great stupa of Swayambhunath in the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal was being erected in the center of the Jonang teaching arena and was warmly greeted by his younger friend and teacher Kunga Drölchok. Generally speaking, there were clearly very cordial relations between Sakya and Jonang masters at this time. Jamyang Chense Wangchuk, whose instruction manuals for major tantric practices in the Sakya tradition are authoritative to the present day, studied with Gorampa as a youth and later with Tsarchin. He also received various teachings from Kunga Drölchok. In particular, from Gorampa he received the full transmission of the Jonang teachings of Dölpopa, the Sakya teachings of the path with the result, and other esoteric instructions. Then he received all the Sakya esoteric transmissions and many Shangpa and Nyingma teachings from Tsarchin and became his principal Dharma heir. Khyentse's autobiography shows that he was deeply committed to meditation practice of both the Jonang and Sakya traditions, in contrast to scholastic studies. On one occasion, he expressed his deep wish to go into isolated retreat far from everyone and practice the Sakya Naro Kachoma for the creation stage meditation and the Jonang six-branch yoga of Kalachakra for the completion stage. This is indeed remarkable for a master who would later ascend Bhutan's teaching throne at Chalu Monastery. One revealing episode occurred when Khyentse Wangchuk visited the Kagyu Monastery of Ralung in 1550. He listened quietly one day as a group of scholars discussed points of doctrine and practice and heard one of them declare that Dölpopa had maintained that a permanent entity existed, which was the Buddha nature. No one disputed this. Khyentse Wangchuk thought to himself that Dölpopa certainly did accept that the Buddha nature was permanent, but he did not accept that it was an entity. In all his writings, Dölpopa had said that the ground of emptiness was unconditioned natural luminosity, and while you could object to this, it was not something that could be proven or refuted through vain argumentation. In any case, Khyentse Wangchuk commented, Bhutan had said the same thing. Once again, the impression is that there was really no serious disagreement between the ultimate intent of the greatest masters, only between later interpreters who did not fully comprehend their teachings. Unlike the works of Kunga Drölchok, in which evidence of Dölpopa's theories is scarce, the writings of Kunga Drölchok's reincarnation, Jetsun Tāranātha, are filled with the teachings of the Shentong and related themes. In the history of the Jonang tradition, Tāranātha is second in importance only to Dölpopa himself. He was responsible for the short-lived Jonang Renaissance in Tsang and central Tibet during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and the widespread revitalization of the Shentong theory in particular. Like Kunga Drölchok, Tāranātha also practiced and taught a wide variety of tantric teachings from different lineages and was very non-sectarian in his approach to realization. He was also one of the last great Tibetan translators of Sanskrit tantric texts. Tāranātha was respectful of all forms of authentic Buddhism, including the tradition of Bhutan and that of the Gelug, which were both antagonistic toward the Jonang. He also emphasized the practice of the Sakya teachings of the path with the result and the esoteric instructions of the Shangpa Kagyu, as had Kunga Drölchok, but focused on the explication of the Kalachakra and the practice of the six-branch yoga as the most profound of all the teachings given by the Buddha. It is especially clear in his writings that Tāranātha considered Dölpopa to be the ultimate authority in matters of doctrine and practice. Tāranātha's autobiography gives exceptional access to the condition of the Jonang tradition from the viewpoint of its leader. He took upon himself the responsibility of causing Dölpopa's insights to once again reach a wide audience and was determined to revive what he saw as a priceless transmission lineage in danger of being lost. For example, in the early 1590s, Tāranātha wrote that it had been many years since the complete instructions of the six-branch yoga had been given in the Jonang assembly. The instruction manual of Dölpopa's Dharma heir, Chogle Namgyal, was still being used at Jonang to teach the six-branch yoga transmitted from Dölpopa, but very few people understood the philosophical tenets of Dölpopa and his disciples. It was even more worrisome that some of the previous holders of the monastic seat of Jonang, such as Lord Orgyen Tsongpa, had given initiations and instructions according to the Jonang tradition, but had also criticized and refuted Dölpopa's Vajra proclamations of the ultimate view of Shentong, which Tāranātha felt was the secret teaching of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. As a result, many unfortunate things had occurred. Even though Tāranātha personally disavowed any ability to refute another system, on this occasion he felt the need to defend the original views of Dölpopa through refutation of erroneous opinions, and to establish the correct interpretations according to his lineage. In 1604, after a decade of great efforts to revive the original Jonang teachings, all of Tāranātha's work was threatened by serious political conflict between the regions of Zhang and Tsang. Jonang itself was in immediate danger of being attacked by hostile armies. While meditating at Dölpopa's great stupa, Tāranātha became very despondent, and seeing all his efforts about to be wiped out, and the tradition itself perhaps destroyed, felt only like going into retreat to practice far away from all the troubles created by deluded and impassioned people. Then, one morning at dawn, the image of Dölpopa at the stupa clearly transformed into Dölpopa himself, and spoke to Tāranātha, encouraging him to continue as before, and assuring him that his efforts would not be in vain. The next night, Tāranātha prayed to Dölpopa, who manifested in the divine form of the Bodhisattva Dharmodgata, and spoke 4 lines of verse that expressed the essence of his doctrine. At that very moment, Tāranātha arrived at the deepest level of Dölpopa's Shentong teachings, and all his uncertainties and doubts were completely removed. He felt that a great key had been placed in his hands with which to open all the doors of the Buddha's doctrine. As an expression of his realization, he then composed the versified text entitled Ornament for the Madhyamaka Emptiness of Other, which is one of his most important works devoted solely to the explication of the Shentong view, and a companion text of quotations from Scripture in support of the ideas therein. Describing the same vision of Dölpopa in another of his autobiographical writings, Tāranātha mentions that he received several prophecies from him, and from that time on met him many times, both actually and in dreams. He comments, "That is the reason I am now an expert in the great omniscient Dölpopa's view and preserve his true intentions." Throughout Tāranātha's life, he often encountered resistance and opposition to the Jonang doctrine of the Shentong. For example, he once spent considerable energy trying to explain the Shentong view to the ruler of Zhang, the abbot of Ngamring Monastery, and a group of scholars who had gathered at Trompa Latse. His audience was interested, but gained absolutely no comprehension of the actual nature and significance of the teachings he gave. The main cause for the inability to understand was that these learned people identified the Shentong doctrine with the tradition of the Chittamatra that did not accept the validity of a cognitive image. The scholars were completely unable to comprehend the great differences between Shentong and Chittamatra. Even masters such as the 6th Shamarpa hierarch of the Kagyu tradition, Chokyi Wangchuk, 1584 to 1635, with whom Tāranātha exchanged letters in about 1620, had mistaken assumptions about the Jonang view. The Shamarpa was under the impression that the Jonang philosophical tenet of a permanent, stable, and eternal absolute entailed the acceptance that the first turning of the Dharma wheel taught the existence of a veridically established absolute. The second taught the non-existence, and the third taught the existence. Tāranātha wrote that the Jonang accepted that all 3 turnings had a single intention, not that the later ones found fault in the earlier ones. Shortly before his death, Tāranātha appointed his disciple Sangye Gyatso, died 1635, as his successor on the monastic seat of Takten Damcho Ling. However, Sangye Gyatso passed away not long after Tāranātha himself. Thus, another of Tāranātha's disciples, Kunga Rinchen Gyatso, was appointed to the monastic seat and led the Jonang tradition for the next 15 years. A series of events then occurred that were crucial for the future of the Jonang tradition, but that have not been clearly explained. It has generally been said in Western works on Tibetan history that the suppression of Jonang and the conversion of its monasteries to the Gelug tradition occurred in 1658. This is only partially correct. The political situation of the 17th century was extremely complex, and to the future misfortune of the Jonang tradition, Tāranātha was one of the main religious advisors to the rulers of Tsang during their struggle against the Gelug powers of central Tibet for political supremacy. Some modern authors have even blamed Tāranātha's role for the eventual Jonang downfall. Although the details are still quite sketchy, a somewhat more complete picture of the situation can now be drawn. In 1642, 7 years after the death of Tāranātha, an alliance of Mongol armies led by Gushri Khan finally defeated the Tsang rulers and enthroned the 5th Dalai Lama, Ngawang Losang Gyatso, 1617-82, as the supreme political ruler of all Tibet. In his autobiography, the Dalai Lama briefly touches on the fate of the Jonang tradition. At the instigation of a certain Jamyang Trulku, a Gelug teaching institute was established at Takten Jamche Ling, the monastery built by Tāranātha not far from the original site of Jonang. The philosophical tenet of the monastery was thus converted from Jonang to Gelug in the Iron Tiger year 1650. This was when the Shentong doctrine was banned at Takten by order of the victorious Gelug authorities. The year 1650 also matches the end of the tenure of Kunga Rinchen Gyatso, who went to live for the latter part of his life at the monastery of Sangak Riwo Dechen. It was originally the prompting of the Jamyang Trulku that provided the pretext for the Dalai Lama to intervene at the Jonang monastery of Takten Damcho Ling. But who was this figure? Fortunately, much earlier in his autobiography, the Dalai Lama identifies Jamyang Trulku as the son of the Khalkha Tushietu king. Now the situation becomes even more interesting. Jamyang Trulku was the son of the Khalkha Mongol Tushietu Khan Gunpo Dorje, and the grandson of Erke Mergen Khan. Better known by the names Yeshe Dorje and Losang Tenpe Gyaltsen, 1635-1723, Jamyang Trulku had actually been recognized by the 5th Dalai Lama, the first Panchen Lama, Losang Chokyi Gyaltsen, 1567-1662, and the Tibetan state oracle as the rebirth of Tāranātha, and as the first of the series of Mongol incarnations known as the Khalkha Jetsun Dampa. He was generally referred to as Jamyang Trulku, emanation of Jamyang, because he was believed to also be the rebirth of Jamyang Choje, 1357-1419, the founder of the great Gelug monastery of Drepung, after which he was said to have appeared as Tāranātha's reincarnation. Yangtze. The earlier lifetime as Jamyang Choje was understandably emphasized by the Gelug authorities to establish a profound prior connection with the Gelug tradition and Lord Tsongkhapa himself. However, the gap of 156 years between the death of Jamyang Choje and the birth of Tāranātha was not explained, and Kunga Drölchok, Tāranātha's predecessor, is not mentioned in the incarnation line of Jamyang Trulku, the Khalkha Jetsun Dampa. The Jonang tradition seems to have played no part in the recognition of its great master's reappearance as a Gelug teacher who now demanded the conversion of Takten Damcha Ling into a Gelug establishment. The biography of the Khalkha Jetsun Dampa contains some interesting material about his recognition as Tāranātha's reincarnation. According to an earlier source quoted in the biography, just before Tāranātha passed away, his Jonang disciples and patrons prayed for him to reincarnate for the purpose of spreading the Jonang doctrine. In this source, he is quoted as having given the following reply: "Be satisfied with just this much expansion of our Jonang doctrine. Through the force of supplications by the Ganden protectors and the force of previous prayers, I will now spread the doctrine of Lord Tsongkhapa in a barbarian borderland." Tāranātha's own extensive autobiographical writings and religious works are filled with evidence of his devotion to Dölpopa and the teachings of definitive meaning that characterize the Jonang tradition. It seems highly unlikely that he would have made such a statement or chosen to be reborn in the very tradition that became the instrument for the destruction of Dölpopa's Jonang tradition as a viable independent school in Tsang and central Tibet. This statement is also not recorded in modern Jonang accounts of Tāranātha's last days, and yet the most unlikely of scenarios appears to have actually occurred. One of Tāranātha's major disciples was a woman known as Jetsun Trinley Wangmo, or Ratna Badrini, 1585-1668, who became a great teacher and lineage holder of the Jonang tradition. She was also Tāranātha's primary consort. Trinley Wangmo's autobiography, with her eyewitness account of Tāranātha's last days, has recently come to light, containing many of her private conversations with the great master. Her description is the original source of all later and less complete versions of these events. Also, when the venerable Lord Tāranātha came here to Jonang once from Takten, he commented, "The other day a certain Drepung monk came. Their Dharma protector also arrived behind him, and said I must come to benefit the Genden doctrine. With fervent devotion in my heart, I immediately accepted." In particular, a day or two after that, a letter of discussion among the officials of Takten was given to me by way of the nephew. The gist of it was insistent. except for as long as the present precious rebirth himself is here. After him, the master of the monastic seat must come from the progeny of our nephew. According to these two earlier and later omens, for me to not take birth in order to maintain the religious and secular traditions is completely natural. Thus, I definitely must take birth in a place that will benefit the Dölpopa doctrine. At that point, I exclaimed, "You must regard us with compassion and remain firmly in this life. Consider all sentient beings in general, and in particular what is crucial for just this monastery. Consider the doctrine of definitive meaning, and once again also benefit the doctrine of this very tradition with your rebirth." But he replied, "Setting aside everything else, even in just all of this upper and lower valley itself, there are many different opinions. You alone have a pure mind. Even so, a single-minded supplication from everyone in unison is necessary. That would be best. Nothing certain will come from just mouthing the words. Now I will fall under the control of what omens come into alignment and what is most intense. If the way to transform omens is understood, it is still possible that I may also benefit the doctrine of this tradition." Contrary to expectations, it is now clear that Tāranātha actually did say he would appear in his next lifetime in a place where he could benefit the Ganden, Gendin, or Dölpopa, all synonyms for Geluk, doctrine. Years later, when Trinley Wangmo finally heard that Tāranātha's reincarnation had appeared in Mongolia, she rejoiced at the news and prayed for him to benefit Tibet. When the 15-year-old Kalka Jetsun, Tāranātha's reincarnation, who had received a strict Geluk education in Mongolia from disciples of the Dalai Lama, asked the Dalai Lama to establish the institute at Tokten, Tāranātha's monastery was converted into a Geluk center. Later, in 1650, the young man traveled to Tashi Lunpo Monastery and received novice vows and various teachings from the first Panchen Lama. Then the Panchen Lama was urgently asked to go to Tokten, undoubtedly for the purpose of accomplishing the conversion into a Geluk monastery. There he gave a number of initiations for the major tantric lineages, followed by the Geluk tradition, and textual transmissions for many of the texts required for the liturgical practices of that tradition. He also gave teachings to the nuns at nearby Jonang during the same visit. Curiously, the Kalka Jetsun himself does not seem to have visited Jonang or Tokten at the same time. Trinley Wangmo specifically says in her autobiography that the Jonang philosophical tenet at Tāranātha's monastery of Tokten Jamcho Ling was changed by order of the government in the 8th month of the Tiger year, 1650. The Dalai Lama notes in his autobiography that the monks who had remained there from before did not actually change their views and practices, and even newly arrived ones were predisposed toward the original Jonang teachings. The Dalai Lama uses the example of brass coated with gold to refer to them as Jonang, with only a Geluk veneer. To remedy the situation, the Geluk authorities expelled the monks to other monasteries, made harsh regulations concerning the Geluk conversion, and gave the monastery the new name Ganden Punsok Ling. These actions were all taken in 1658. From this point, the Jonang tradition ceased to exist as an independent entity in Tsang and central Tibet. The Jonang teachings of the Shentong and the Kalachakra continued to be transmitted even in those regions, but the tradition's monasteries and hermitages in the far eastern area of Amdo now became the only remaining institutions that were openly Jonang. The connection between Jonang in Tsang and the eastern regions of Tibet had been established more than 300 years before, when Tsen Khawoché had studied with Dölpopa himself for 6 years and then returned home to found a hermitage in Kham. The master Ratnasri, 1350 to 1435, later traveled from the east to central Tibet and Tsang, and received a vast number of teachings from several of Dölpopa's great Dharma heirs, such as Chogyal Namgyal, Mati Panchen, and Nyaön Kungapal. After returning home, in 1425, Ratnasri founded the monastery now known as Choje Gun in Zamtang, which became the main monastery of the Jonang tradition in Amdo. In the 17th century, Lodro Namgyal, 1618 to 83, received the Jonang transmissions in Tsang from Tāranātha and Kunga Rinchen Gyatso, and later lived and taught at Tsangwagun in Zamtang for many years. Soon after the death of Tāranātha in 1635, the master Kunga Palsang traveled to Tsang and received the Jonang teachings at Tokten and Jonang from several of Tāranātha's major disciples, such as Kunga Rinchen Gyatso, Lodro Namgyal, and especially Jetsun Trinley Wangmo, and later established the monastery of Droge-gun in the Ngawa region. The Jonang tradition has continued to thrive in eastern Tibet, with a strong presence today in the areas of Zamtang, Gyalrong, Ngawa, and elsewhere. The Shentong view and the Kalachakra practices are thus fully maintained in the Jonang tradition in Amdo at the beginning of the 21st century. However, these teachings have been passed down in the mainstream of Tibetan Buddhism primarily due to the efforts of several great Nyingma and Kagyu masters from the area of Kham in eastern Tibet. The Jonang tradition itself has flourished in the relative isolation of Amdo, but it does not seem to have had widespread influence outside of that region. The Nyingma master Katok Riksin Tsewang Norbu, 1698 to 1755, began a general renaissance of the Jonang teachings of the Shentong and the Kalachakra by introducing them to some of the leading Kagyu teachers of his time. In one of his versified autobiographical accounts, Tsewang Norbu notes that even as a child, he felt great faith whenever he heard the names of Dölpopa and his immediate disciples. His natural affinity for the Shentong view and the Kalachakra teachings became understandable later when the master from whom he received the transmission of the Jonang teachings recognized him as the rebirth of Dölpopa's disciple Mati Panchen Lodro Gyaltsen, one of the pair of translators responsible for the Jonang translation of the Kalachakra Tantra and the Stainless Light. In 1726, as Tsewang Norbu was passing through the Tsang region en route to the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal, he first tried to obtain the Jonang teachings from the great yogin Khunsang Wangpo, who was in strict retreat at the hermitage of Rulong Drepung, which had been renamed Gandin Kache when converted into a Gelug establishment. Tsewang Norbu was not even able to see Khunsang Wangpo, although he spent 3 days trying. He was very impressed with this master's dedicated meditation practice and became even more determined to receive the Jonang transmissions from him. On his return to Tibet toward the end of 1728, Tsewang Norbu again approached Khunsang Wangpo, and this time succeeded in receiving the entire transmission of the Jonang teachings. Khunsang Wangpo bestowed the guiding instructions of the view of Shentong, or Great Madhyamaka, the full Kalachakra initiations, the complete instructions of the six-branch yoga, and many non-sectarian teachings. Tsewang Norbu also received Kunga Drölchok's 100 guiding instructions of Jonang, and the reading transmission of the collected works of both Dölpopa and Tāranātha. Although the Jonang monasteries in Tsang and central Tibet had been converted to the Gelug tradition, this shows that the original teachings of Dölpopa and his great successors were still taught and practiced in those same centers even in the middle of the 18th century. The fifth Dalai Lama's earlier attempts to stamp out the Jonang teachings had been successful only on the surface, as was the case in the initial phases of the conversion operation discussed above. Contrary to the general impression, the teaching transmissions had survived not only in the far eastern region of Amdo, but in the original Tsang areas near Jonang. This is further clarified by the fact that Tsewang Norbu traveled again to Jonang in 1734, ascended the teaching throne previously occupied by Dölpopa and Tāranātha, and gave many initiations, textual transmissions, and esoteric instructions of the original Jonang teachings to a large gathering. During this period at least, the Gelug authorities were obviously not exerting great efforts to prevent the teachings of the Jonang tradition from being spread or revived even in Tsang. Tsewang Norbu later gave the Jonang teachings in central Tibet, where he passed a number of transmissions to the 13th Karmapa Dudul Dorje, 1733-97, and the 10th Shamarpa Chudrup Gyatso, 1742-92. However, Tsewang Norbu's most significant role in terms of the continuation of the Jonang lineages was as a teacher of the great Situ Panchen Chokye Jungne, 1700-1774. Situ Panchen had already been to Takten and Jonang in 1723, several years before Tsewang Norbu's first visit. From the description in Situ's autobiography, it was an important event. His account mentions that Tāranātha's silver stupa reliquary at Takten had been destroyed long before, when the Gelug conversion was ordered by the fifth Dalai Lama at the instigation of his teacher Mandrapa. Situ notes that Takten was now a Gelug institute, but some old monks had not given up the original Jonang tradition. He tried to obtain copies of Jonang writings, but they had been placed under seal by the order of the Tibetan central government. Situ felt great sadness at the misfortune that had so quickly overtaken Tāranātha's monastery, and lamented the degenerate times. Going to Jonang the next day, he found about 700 nuns who had not changed their tradition from Jonang to Gelug. 25 years later, in 1748, Tsewang Norbu and Situ Panchen spent time together in the Kathmandu Valley of Nepal. Situ had clearly been very interested in the Jonang tradition for many years, but it was his teacher, Tsewang Norbu, who now insisted that he accept the Shentong view, which he taught him in great detail, apparently at the stupa of Bodhnath. Situ says Tsewang Norbu ordered him to uphold the profound view of the Shentong, and told him acceptance of this view would create an auspicious pattern of events that would lead to Situ's longevity and the vast spread of his activities. Situ also mentions several different types of Shentong, among which he adhered most closely to that of the Seventh Lord and Silungpa, which was somewhat different from that of Dölpopa. In the end, it would be Situ, more than anyone, who would create the environment for the widespread acceptance of the Shentong teachings in Tibet during the next century. As Gene Smith first mentioned in 1970, it was Situ who had blended the seemingly irreconcilable Shentong and Mahamudra positions and spread them throughout the Kagyupa traditions of Kham. The eventual result of this revival, outside the Jonang areas in Amdo, by Tsewang Norbu and Situ Panchen, was the crucial role of the Shentong and other Jonang teachings in the phenomenal non-sectarian Rime movement of 19th century Kham. Spread by such great masters as Za Patrul, 1808-87, Jamgon Kongtrul, 1813-1900, Jamyang Chense Wangpo, 1820-92, and later Mipam Gyatso, 1846-1912. Jamgon Kongtrul was the most assertive of these teachers in his advocacy of the Shentong, which he fully incorporated into his own immensely influential works. Kongtrul was also devoted to the six-branch yoga of the Kala Chakra, for which he carefully followed the tradition of Dölpopa and Tāranātha. The Shentong and the Jonang practices of the six-branch yoga have reached a widespread audience through the lineages of Kongtrul, Chense, and Mipam, but the Jonang tradition in Amdo has continued to produce many great masters of their special teachings. The prolific author Bamda Gelik Gyatso, 1844-1904, was probably the tradition's most influential teacher in the late 19th century, and his disciple Tsoknyi Gyatso, 1880-1940, was very highly regarded. The Jonang tradition in Amdo has been graced by a series of remarkable masters into the 20th first century. Tsoknyi Gyatso's disciple Nawang Lodro Drakpa, 1920-75, was the author of a large treatise on the Shentong and an extensive history of the Jonang tradition. Khenpo Lodrak, as he is often called, was perhaps the most famous Jonang master of the 20th century. Kunga Tugje Palsang, 1925-2000, and Ngawang Yunten Sangpo, 1928-2002, were also great recent teachers. Masters in the lineages of Kongtrul, Chense, and Mipam have continued to have a great impact in Tibet, India, and beyond. Dzongtsar Chense Rinpoche, Jamyang Chokyi Lodro, 1896-1959, the great heir to the non-sectarian movement, greatly appreciated the Shentong. In his secret autobiography, he writes of a marvelous dream vision of Tāranātha, who bestowed upon him the Kala Chakra initiation. This experience in 1943 caused him to have the greatest faith in Tāranātha. More recently, the eminent masters Dingo Chense Rinpoche, 1910-91, Kala Rinpoche, 1905-89, and Dudjom Rinpoche, 1904-87, all accepted the Shentong view. Most Kagyu and Nyingma teachers follow the lines of explication and practice passed down by these last three masters, and the Shentong interpretations of Kongtrul and Mipam in particular are now prevalent. All the special teachings of the Jonang lineage and the vital transmission of the collected writings of Dölpopa and Tāranātha have been maintained by the Jonang tradition in Amdo. But even the reading transmission of any of Dölpopa's writings seems scarce among leading Shentong adherents of the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions. When the Shentong is taught by these teachers, the different works of Kongtrul and Mipam, which vary a great deal from the original teachings of Dölpopa, are usually the treatises of choice. What is now taught as the Shentong view in the Kagyu and Nyingma traditions represents a synthesis that has developed over time, primarily in order to make Dölpopa's most profound insights to be incorporated into the established doctrines of the Great Seal and the Great Perfection. Thus, the Shentong view and six-branch yoga taught by the living masters of the Jonang tradition in Amdo, based on the oral transmission and literary legacy of the ancient masters of Jonang, is certainly closer to what was transmitted centuries ago by Dölpopa and Tāranātha. In the following chapter, some of the most essential aspects of Dölpopa's own doctrine will be presented as a preface to the translations of his works in Part 2.